The entire Mass Effect trilogy is my favorite video game series of all time. The suicide mission itself might be my favorite moment in all of media, whether video games or movies. This episode has been one of my most anticipated for me to dive deep and just begin to grasp how the lead composer of Mass Effect 2, Jack Wall, created such a compelling and epic music at the climax of the game. Before we dive right in, please consider letting me know if you like this channel. Check the subscribe button below if you would like to help grow and support music design. Thank you. The entire Mass Effect score, especially in Mass Effect 1 and 2, took inspiration from many of Vangelis' movie scores, notably Blade Runner. However, as we progress through game to game through the series, the score noticeably becomes more orchestral and more heroic. For this epic tune from the Suicide Mission, Jack Wall utilizes a mostly orchestral palette along with a couple synthetic instruments. The song actually begins mostly electronic, beginning with this synth lead. Now the only other electronic sounds are the synth bells and the tapping light percussion. And then finally the electronic bass. Now for ensembles, Jack goes heavy on the epic ensembles, featuring a full string ensemble, a full brass ensemble, and later in the piece he'll bring in the choir. Lastly, we'll also take a look at how Jack creates this big drum sound when we get to section A. But now let's go back to the intro. For quite the epic piece of music that the Suicide Mission is, it begins very soft and unassuming at first. An interesting to note about this song is that it uses a 7/4 time signature. The song would then be counted up using 4 beats and then an extra 3 beats after, such as in the intro. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Now for this synth lead, I enabled gliding on these notes rather than normal legato, so that the notes ever so subtly jump up and down when the notes overlap each other. We'll see this pattern repeat throughout this first section. Once we hear the next few instruments join in with the synth lead, a familiar theme is played in the synth bells. This will be the main theme of this song. I just love how we first hear this theme very quietly here in the intro, but it'll soon morph into one of the most bombastic and epic pieces on the entire Mass Effect soundtrack. These bells have a nice decay to them, meaning that they slowly fade out over time. They just need to pluck these single notes to indicate that theme. Now accompanying the bells is the light percussion or the tapping. This adds to the syncopation along with the delay plugin I added to it. Lastly, the bass, which is purely electronic, outlines the main chord progressions we'll hear later in the song. As opposed to what we'll soon hear, this bass uses a pizzicato style that contrasts really well with the sustained synth bell. Now let's play this intro for you. The tension starts to rise in the build-up. The synth lead continues its same pattern as before, but now we start to introduce orchestral elements. Starting with the cellos, they essentially take over the role of the bass from before and outline the chord progression. I use both a standard cello ensemble and a solo double bass underneath to give it extra low impact. The violin and viola spiccato strings fade in with the cello. Intriguingly, this melody and these two strings will later be played in the choir when we get to that section. A great technique in music is to foreshadow themes to come, displaying them first quietly before expanding the theme to its full potential. What I like about this section is how it introduces all the elements one at a time. So first we have the cello and the extra percussion layered together, and then the violins and violas join. Finally, the solo horn plays a major theme in the song. All of these elements joined one after the other make for a more exciting song to listen to. Looking at the percussion now, Jack utilizes a hi-hat for extra movement in this section. As you can see, it's not just playing straight 16th notes, but includes these brief pauses so that the overall part is more interesting. The oil cans go very well with the hi-hats and almost give off a sending of impending pressure. Our last instrument here is the bass. This time I use a more sustained sub-bass, targeting those extreme lower frequencies. Usually adding a sub-bass like this can increase the epic quality of the song. Now let's put all those sections together and take a listen. Suddenly, these huge percussive drums clue us in that this will be one of the most intense action sequences in all of video games. The drums are made up of many different sounds, as you can see, and overall it follows only a measure-long pattern that repeats itself over the course of the song. However, I don't mind the repetition because the pattern itself is extremely memorable and catchy. Who hasn't air drummed to this? There's also a snare pattern that increasingly becomes more prevalent later in the song. Fitting since Commander Shepard and his or her squad are mostly military members. Let's look at the strings. In the violins, we see two different parts, the spiccato section that continues from the last section, and the sustained lead played in the octave. The spiccato section is very simple actually, as it just repeats this one measure long melody. The sustained notes descend down the scale of D minor, which is the key of the song. In the second half here, they'll accompany the lead horn as one of the main themes in the Mass Effect series. Since the violas have the exact same function as the violins, let's check out the cellos. These are very deep in their orchestration, which is why I included the double bass, because cellos can't reach down that far. The horn ensemble consists of three parts. Horns 1 and 2 only have one line in them usually. I cheated a little bit and used this tuba to double up the other two horns by copying their exact same melody. This thickens up the song here a great deal, which is why this part sounds very large. Continuing on to section A2, a few functions change in the instruments, but let's continue listening to that entire brass together. Now the key to writing great and big brass parts like this is to know when to use separate voices and when to have unison parts. Also take into account using different octaves to increase the presence. Overall, the main melody should come through about 80% of the overall sound, but the other 20% should be reserved for different lines. Now what's notable in this section A2 is that the violins and violas change their function. So it's a bit more intense here. Again, a lot of repetition here, but that's fine as long as the other instruments shine through with a clear melody, as they do in the brass. Now let's take into account all these intricate parts and watch the magic unfold as we play through section A. This is my favorite moment in the song. It is a fantastic use of bringing back an old and familiar melody, that being one of the elements of the main theme of Mass Effect. What I'm referring to is the synth lead, which makes a return with this wonderful melody. This pattern will continue until the rest of this interlude. Violins drop off just for a moment, allowing the viola spiccato to shine through. You'll notice that the pace of this section noticeably drops down a tad, and this viola section is relatively simple to reflect that. Then later on we see the violas join in. And as we get further and further, more voices get added in. Eventually we see this octave violin join in too. The newly added choir, which actually faded in just a measure before the interlude, is a great addition here. Again, it doesn't use too many voices here, nor is it too complex, but provides a great, nice pad underneath the string leads. Lastly, the bass and cello follow the same function as before, being the very deep quality of this section. At the end of this interlude, almost all the orchestral instruments sweep in to jump us into section B. So let's take a listen to the interlude. If you didn't think it could get any bigger, it has. Cellos, heavy percussion, and bass largely remain the same, so let's focus on what's happening in the violas and violins. Section B is primarily all sustained notes, so that we can hear the main melody right out in front of the mix. If you notice carefully in the violins here, there are two voices going on at once. The higher notes you see highlighted act as a very high and lush pad, while the lower single notes provide a little support to the main melody. The violas give some mid-range support to that. Let's hear both of them together. And then with the cellos, it sounds like this. Taking a look at the entire brass ensemble, look at how busy the tubas are. A 4-note chord here at the beginning is devastating. To avoid sounding too large, try not to restrict playing too many notes at once. 4 is probably the maximum. The melody in this brass section is a slight variation on the main theme we heard in section 1. Jumping ahead to section B2 and sticking with the choir, they rapidly switch to shouting staccato phrases. This part is very epic, so let's listen to the entire section B2 together. Section B3 is absolutely massive. The violins are playing near the top of the register. And most of the instruments here play a further variation of the main theme, just to add an additional further tension and to keep the listener's attention. So remember what I said about the 4 notes in the brass? Well, I sort of broke that rule here. On the Mars scale of rock and metal hardness, this section is probably a straight out 10. One last interesting detail Jack Wall utilizes at the end is how the trumpets switch to a flutter tongue, which is a really biting sound. The ending calms things down after the massive last few sections. Most of the instruments are removed, leaving only the cellos, the heavy percussion, the oil cans, and later on the solo horn. The cellos only sustain on the C note. The heavy percussion largely retains its groove, but is toned back just a bit. And the oil cans reference back a previous part of the song as sort of a bookends. And finally the solo horn brings back one last call for the melody. The Suicide Mission and its music is such a classic moment in gaming that will be embedded in the minds of those who played through the series forever. Please watch my interview with Jack Wall as he shares his experience and secrets while working on the Mass Effect 2 score. He's an awesome guy to chat with, and I hope you can learn a thing or two from our chat. If you want to help grow this channel and to reach more well-known composers, consider helping me out on Patreon and becoming a part of the community. I thank all my current Patreons for giving me the support I need to keep making videos like these. Farewell.